Okay, so to start off with, I'd like to introduce myself as Becca. Along with my team of 4, I oversee the Trust CF Trials Accelerator Programme, which aims to support setup and delivery of CF trials here in the UK. This evening we'll be joined by a panel of guest speakers, including CF doctors, CF trial coordinator, and people with CF who have taken part in clinical trials. Our guest panel will be talking about the importance of clinical trials, what their experiences of taking part in trials have been like, and what emerging therapies we can expect to see coming through clinical trials in the near future. We'll then finish this evening's event off with a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for any of our guest speakers, please submit them via the chat box and we'll try our best to get those questions answered. If for any reason we don't answer your question because either we run out of time or we feel the answer needs a bit more time, we'll contact you after the event with an answer. Okay. Before I pass over to our first guest speaker, I just wanted to spend a bit of time to introduce you to clinical trials and the Trials Accelerator Programme. Just bear with me a moment, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, as you'll see from this image, clinical trials are the really very critical middle step between developing a new medication from the lab to when it's available for prescription on the NHS. Without clinical trials, we wouldn't be able to assess whether any new medications are safe or effective for use. And none of the medications that any of us take today, including those for CF, would actually be available. It can take some time to develop a new medication. So when a medication leaves the lab and goes through the clinical trials process to when it actually becomes licensed for use on the NHS, it can take many years, which is why it's absolutely essential that we ensure there are appropriate resources and infrastructure in place to support the delivery of CF trials, so that we can bring the most effective new treatments to the CF community as quickly as we possibly can. This is why the CF Trust about 4 years ago set up the CF Trials Accelerator Programme to ensure that we have, in the UK, we are in a position to support the exciting and growing number of new therapies being developed in the UK and around the world. And we'll hear a little bit more about those new therapies from one of our guest speakers soon. The CF Trials Accelerator Programme brings together 44 paediatric and adult CF centres from around the UK who collectively lead in the delivery of a large number of clinical trials. As part of the programme, we fund 20 CF trial coordinators who are based around the UK and support the CF community to learn about and take part in relevant clinical trial opportunities. And we've also created a host of information about taking part in trials, including information booklets for children and adults and parents, and our CF Trials Tracker database where you can find your own clinical trial opportunities to take part in. Okay. Since we launched the Trials Accelerator 3 years ago, over 600 people with CF, including adults and children, have taken part in a trial. This is really exciting because it's showing the Trials Accelerator is achieving the impact that we desired, which is bringing new medications to the CF community where they have the opportunity to have early access to these new therapies through taking part in a trial, but also ensuring that the UK is a significant contributor towards the global efforts to develop new therapies for CF. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to our first guest speaker, Dr. Rebecca Brendall, who's a consultant respiratory paediatrician and Associate Director of Research at Alderhay Children's Hospital. And Rebecca will be talking about the impact of clinical trials on clinical care.
Hi there. Thank you for that, and thank you for asking me to speak about this topic tonight. I'm just going to share my slides now. So hopefully you can all see that. So I'm going to start with recapping a little about what Becca's just said about clinical trials. What are they and why do we need them? So Becca said some of this already. So a clinical trial compares the effects of one treatment with another. It may involve patients, it may involve healthy people, or may involve both. It's a really key research tool for advancing medical knowledge and for advancing patient care. And we do clinical trials if we don't know if a treatment is safe and effective, or whether it's better than existing options. If you just introduce a new treatment to clinical practice without checking if it's safe and without doing a clinical trial, it takes a long time to figure out if side effects are just happening by chance or if they are due to a treatment. And it takes a long time to figure out if something is actually effective. Ideally, you want to have unbiased comparators. So you need to have two groups and you're comparing two even groups so that you can make sure that everything that you are seeing is an impact of the treatment itself and not of other factors that are going on in life around us. We haven't always been doing clinical trials, and if we look at CF research back in the 1950s, one of the big things in the 1950s was pancreatic enzymes. Now, most people with CF, as you well know, will need pancreatic enzymes, and that was only discovered in the 1950s. Prior to that, there were significant malnutrition because of this problem. However, there wasn't a clinical trial, and some physicians didn't believe that they were helpful. Some people found that when they gave them to the children, because of course back in the 1950s it was all children with cystic fibrosis, we didn't have an adult CF population at that point, and they found that the children's appetites got worse and didn't feel them to be effective. So it took a long time before it was accepted and recognised that pancreatic enzymes were necessary. And if there'd been a clinical trial, that could have happened much sooner. Similarly, with chest physiotherapy, you'll be very used to your team harping on you about the importance of chest physiotherapy. Now, there hasn't been any clinical trials done on this, and in fact, back in the 1950s, it was stated by some people that they described the impact of putting people with head down and percussing their chests was an entirely futile exercise. And now we will all disagree with that, but there were no clinical trials to prove it. What's really interesting is that there was a research-orientated treatment program for CF, which was started in the 1950s, and that was started after a request by a CF parents group, which just highlights how important kind of patient and parent advocacy has been for such a long time, right from the 1950s. As it was that group and the advocacy from them that got the doctors to start this research-orientated treatment program. And the things that were identified as being important back then in the 1950s are still important and relevant today. The four main topics back then that they talked about was early correct diagnosis, regular physiotherapy, frequent respiratory cultures, and mucolytic nebulizers, all of which remain relevant. Moving into modern era, in the 90s, it was recognised that most studies that were done were single centre small studies with just very small amounts of people. And it was recognised that very few results we didn't really learn very much from that way. It took a long time and a lot of small studies before you could make any accurate interpretation. And what we needed was multi-centre studies and a lot of collaboration between centres, nationally and internationally. And that's come on a lot since that time. One of the big trials to come out of the 1990s was the DNase trial, for which it was a multi-centre study of over almost 1,000 people, which showed an improvement in lung function by about 6%, which was a significant amount. Moving on to the 2000s, another clinical trial looked at exercise, and a 3-year study showed the benefit of exercise, which is really important. Up until then, people had been advocating it without actually evidence to go along with it. The ASLE trial, inhaled astriona, was a big study and done internationally in the 2000s. And then coming on to the more modern studies, the Vertex studies, which we are all familiar with, and the ivacaftor study. But again, this highlights the importance of clinical trials. We started with ivacaftor clinical trials, and that showed amazing benefit for people with the G551D genetic variant. However, we then came to Orkambi. Now, in the laboratory, we found that Orkambi was fantastic, but it worked much better on paper than it did in reality. And had we not done that clinical trial and found it not to be as effective as we'd all hoped it would be, we may not have gone on to get the triple therapy Kaftrio as early as we had done. It may have taken many years of clinical experience and disappointment at the results of Orkambi had we not done the clinical trials. Again, with gene therapy, we had high hopes for gene therapy, which sadly hasn't had the great results that we'd hoped it would. And it's very important that we did that clinical trial. Otherwise, we could have introduced something into clinical practice that wasn't actually as effective as we may have hoped. So that highlights the importance of clinical trials. Even if we don't get a positive result and the result that we want to, it's really important that that study is done. So the benefits of the clinical trial to the population of people with CF are quite apparent: advancement in clinical knowledge, advancement in clinical care, access to new treatments, to improved treatments, and better outcomes, with not only with life expectancy, which is significantly different now to it was 30, 40 years ago, but also that's meant to say the quality of life as well. So not just life expectancy, but quality of life, which is really important. We think about treatments as the medications that we take, but it's not just about the medications that we take. Those pictures will illustrate the impact of clinical trials on the equipment that we use as well. And you'll see there an older style nebulizer device. It says there that that's a better ultrasonic nebulizer, so presumably there were ones prior to that that looked even more cumbersome. And yet most of us will be familiar with the picture on the right-hand side, the blue iNeb, and you can see the difference in the years that the nebulizers have changed to more portable devices. And again, with our spirometry, some people will be familiar with the older style vitalographs that we have lung function measured by, and yet we come on to more modern techniques, and many of you will be measuring your lung function at home these days. That's a NuvaWare now, but there are many different brands around. And it's not just our medication that we take, but the equipment around us that has come on leaps and bounds with clinical trials. Not only is there population benefits to clinical trials, but actually what are the benefits to you as an individual for taking part in clinical trials? Well, for one, adherence to treatments. It's been shown again and again that people get better in clinical trials even if they're not taking any active treatments. And it's felt that people, because they're in a clinical trial, they adhere to their routine treatments perhaps a little bit more readily than they were doing beforehand. There's a lot of treatment that people take, and I appreciate it's difficult to get everything done, but that does seem to be done more in a clinical trial. There's also the opportunity to access treatments earlier than other people. If you're participating in a clinical trial, that may be relevant for some trials. More frequent reviews, which I've starred there because that may be a positive thing or it may be a negative thing depending on your point of view, but hopefully you would view more frequent reviews as a positive thing, and that can have an impact on your clinical care and a beneficial impact there. For some people, it's not just about themselves, but they really feel the benefit of participating in clinical trials as the opportunity to help others in the future. Some people will feel that they have benefited from research in the past, and they really want that opportunity to help others in the future, even if it doesn't necessarily benefit themselves. And for them, that's a real positive and a real benefit to taking part in a clinical trial. Becca said earlier that there have been 655 people with CF taken part or currently taking part in clinical trials since 2017, which is fantastic to have such an active participation in these trials. So where do we go next? Well, there's a lot still to be done. We need better mucolytics, we need different antibiotics, and of course we need better different modulators. There are not modulators for everybody yet, and we need to continue with those. But also, when we ask people what is the main problem, for a lot of people it's the burden of care. And so one of the clinical trials that is going to be done next year is trying to reduce the burden of care. Doing the mucolytic nebulizers or nebulizers seems to be a thing that takes a lot of time, and for a lot of people it would be better if they didn't have to do that in terms of quality of life. And so what this clinical trial is looking at, it's looking at, can you safely stop your DNAs and or hypertonic saline nebulizers once people are established on Kaftrio? That's something that is being asked again and again, and will hopefully improve people's quality of life if they are safely able to stop that. So this clinical trial, many people will have an opportunity to participate in next year, looking for over 700 people, and it's going to be run nationally, and hopefully is a clinical trial that will find that we can improve people's quality of life even further than adding triple therapy. And I know that one of the other guest speakers is going to speak later on about other clinical trials and what's in the pipeline. So that's all I've got to say. I'll hand back to you, Becca. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. That was really interesting, and it was really nice just to kind of help set the context of clinical trials and how they're so critical at improving clinical care going forward. If you have any questions for Rebecca or any of our guest speakers, do remember to submit them via the chat, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the event. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Lorna Allen, who's our involvement manager for the Trials Accelerator. Lorna will be joined by a number of people with CF who have taken part in trials, alongside one of our CF trial coordinators who supports children and families to take part in trials.
Thanks, Becca. So I've worked at the Trust for 4 years this week, but I've been a supporter of the Trust for much longer and had interest in the development of new treatments, as I'm CF mum too. My daughter's nearly 23. But my role at the Trust is to ensure that the CF community have the opportunity to influence and shape how clinical trials are run in the UK. And we do that through the community involvement workstream of the Clinical Trials Accelerator platform. So through that workstream, we really act as a conduit between research teams and pharmaceutical companies to really connect those with people living with CF and their families, so that those companies that they're not only producing trials that may benefit people with CF, they've got to really consider how those trials are going to impact on their lives. So it's really important that we understand what people's experiences are living with CF, what their experiences are of taking part in trials, and how that can be fitted in around daily life. I was really interested to hear what Rebecca said there about how in the 1950s some of that was driven by a group of parents, and that's really what we're trying to do, is really ensure that our CF community is involved in developing trials that are going forward. So I'm really pleased to be joined by a few people this evening. So Jane, Rob, Caitlin and Vicky, if you want to pop your cameras on, and then we've got some questions really to just ask you about your clinical trials experiences. So I was going to start with Jane. I know you've taken part in a variety of trials over the years, haven't you?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Can you explain how your recruitment into a trial has changed, perhaps from the early days until now?
Yes, I think the first drug I ever tested was ciprofloxacin, and my introduction to the trial was, you'll be doing this and taking these tablets and off we go. There was no information available about what I might experience, who did I contact if I had a problem, although it was noted later that probably the doctor had got a very nice holiday or a television out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I hopefully when we chat to Vicky, our trial coordinator, later, that she'll really show how the role of her role changes that, you know, with people's experience of recruitment. So you mentioned that you trialled ciprofloxacin. How's that helped your treatment over the years, and what do you think could have been improved about that?
It would have been nice to know a little bit more about the drug. Whether it is true or not, I'm not entirely sure, but I do believe it has affected my feet, and it affected my friend's feet the same with plantar fasciitis. But
Yeah.
obviously that's part of the trial, and you do have to weigh up. To me, it was a no-brainer. It meant I could have 2 weeks of tablets and not be in hospital when I'd not long started work at 18, 19. as opposed to having problems with my feet in later life. It could have also been to do with the 4-inch heels that I used to wear on my shoes, if I'm absolutely honest. But yeah, that's
like you're
part of
saying
it.
there, the convenience of having those tablets to take, though, say the impact on your daily life is huge.
It meant I could stay at work. It was the difference between having to give up work and carrying on taking them. I did also notice I got a wonderful suntan when I had Cipro and went on holiday to Greece. Nobody had actually mentioned that it could affect your sensitivity to the sun. And for the first time in my life, I couldn't understand why I was burning and had to keep putting factor 30 on. So it is about the information that's passed over to you that is terribly useful.
Yeah, and as I say, monitoring those side effects, obviously, to feed that back to other people who are taking the medication.
Yeah.
But you didn't get a chance to take part in the ivacaftor trials, but you have access to that medication now, haven't you?
Yes, I had a particularly horrible year in 2015. Everything was going wrong. I had problems, nothing at all to do with CF, because I'd got bored with that, developed something else. Had to give up my job. Everything seemed to be going wrong. But at the end of that year, I had a letter that suddenly said I was eligible to go on to ivacaftor Kalydeco, and that I had the gene that was most unusual. I think I was the only one in the West Midlands with it. And so I was able to start Kalydeco in January 16. And it's absolutely life-saving and life-enhancing. It's improved my lung function by by 50%. I dropped down to sort of about 50%. And now I'm back up to the 90s.
It's incredible. And you say that's because of people obviously taking part in that trial elsewhere.
Oh my God, yes. And I'm 57.
That's
so
fantastic.
I'd throw that in case you thought any of the drugs were aging.
I know you're very proud, and you rightly so. So Caitlin, you've heard Jane there say that she had the opportunity to trial Cipro. I expect you've taken a few courses of that yourself, haven't you?
Yes, and I don't tolerate it very well at all.
No.
No.
At least there's some alternatives as well. So Caitlin, you had the chance to join a couple of trials while you were in under the care of your paediatric team. Can you tell us a bit about those?
So I was, I'm under lead CF team, and I got, it was kind of suggested to me by my doctor and clinical trials coordinator about Symkevi trial, and I think that was in 2016. And I think because so I've got the most common gene type of CF, so I'm double delta F508. So it was because I think with the trials is there's a certain kind of bracket that you have to fit into in terms of like health wise and your gene type. So luckily kind of fit into that, and it was just kind of recommended to me as a good idea. And for me, I was just for it because it was a way of giving back to the CF community after everything they've done for me growing up and looking after me. So I was on the Symkevi trial for about 3 years, and then this summer started onto the Kaftrio trial as well.
So that was a step from one to the other, wasn't it, to show potential improvement from taking Symkevi and moving on, as you say, to the triple therapy, which we now know as Kaftrio, as opposed to people who may be starting the triple therapy from scratch, who weren't the double delta F508. It's really interesting what you said there about your reasons for taking part, about how you wanted to give something back, not just to the CF community, but to your team that had looked after you as well. So would you consider taking part in another trial if you had the opportunity?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Can you remember if there were any questions that you were asking your team before you took part in the trial about what would happen?
I didn't ask any questions. I was very much just, like, read through the information. I was like, yep, I want to do it. So it did take a lot of convincing. So
really reassuring. And obviously you had additional monitoring through all that time as well. So Rob, you've had a chance to take part in quite a few trials over the years as well, haven't you?
Yep, I think I've done more than I can remember because I started doing them in paediatrics.
Go on, carry on.
It's really interesting hearing Jane and Caitlin's experience, because so much of it resonates with mine. Especially.
So I was going to say you had the chance to take part in the triple therapy trial, didn't you? But then you weren't able to carry that through. So did you want to explain why?
Yeah. I was meant to take part in the Kaftrio trial about 18 months ago, and unfortunately, literally the day before I was meant to take my first dose, I had a call from my clinic team because my annual review sputum had grown and a non-tuberculous mycobacterium, NTM culture, which was a completely new thing to me, and unfortunately that made me ineligible for the trial. In a way, it was quite lucky because I hadn't taken my first dose, so I would have had to still be monitored if I was withdrawing in the middle of the trial. But it was a really difficult time anyway for any of you out there who've had to go through an NTM diagnosis and dealing with whether you treat it or not. It's a very difficult time, and to have on top of that I'd been sort of this close to maybe taking Kaftrio on a trial was quite tough.
Yeah, and that really highlights what Caitlin was saying there earlier as well about it's sort of like the inclusion and exclusion criteria of a trial, and the sort of the cut-off points for people being able to join and not being able to join. And it's quite a difficult scenario to be in. But you did previously have a chance to take part in the running study for gene therapy. Can you explain a bit about that study and what it was aiming to achieve?
Yeah, so this was about 11 years ago now, where I took part in the run-in study for a gene therapy trial. And in this particular study, I was only taking one dose, but I knew that I wasn't on any placebo or anything, because it was just looking at the safety of the delivery of a dose and whether there were any adverse reactions at that time. There was a really interesting trial to do. It was the first one I'd done where it had a lot more involvement in terms of time and commitment to the trial, because everything I'd done before, a lot of them were either alongside my clinic appointments or just another short appointment, whereas this trial involved several whole day appointments, and I even had to make a trip away to go to another hospital that had different equipment for measuring your lung clearance index. So that was the first trial I'd done that really required quite significant participation, but it was really exciting to be part of what could have been really cutting edge medical developments.
And as Rebecca said earlier, even though gene therapy perhaps hasn't progressed as we had all hoped and anticipated, all those early stages of the studies are so important in what comes in the following steps and stages. So what has it meant to you to take part in these trials? I know you'd mentioned before that you had also trials or joined a trial that was looking at the use of flixityde, and that changed your treatment regime.
Yeah, that was one where the result of the trial immediately had a beneficial impact on my day-to-day life. That was where I'd already been taking flixityde as part of my normal treatment, but there was a study, I think it was called CF-WISE, and it was looking to see whether that was really beneficial, particularly I think I was a teenager at the time. And then at the end of the trial, when it was unblinded and we found out whether I was on the placebo or still on flixityde, it turned out I had been moved on to the placebo, and I'd had no change to my lung function, so I was able to stop taking that, which is great to just be taken off a steroid in your teens. So that had an immediate benefit to me.
Yeah, a little bit of reduction in your treatment regime.
Yeah.
So I'm going to chat to Vicky now. So Vicky, you're one of our trial coordinators that's funded through the Clinical Trials Accelerator platform. Can you just say a little bit about your role?
Yeah, of course. So hi everyone, my name's Vicky and I'm the trial coordinator at Alder Hey Children's Hospital in Liverpool. So we are a paediatric site up in Liverpool. So Yeah, as Becca mentioned before, I'm one of 20 CTAP coordinators based across the whole of the UK, and each coordinator is a member of a specialist CF centre. One of the coordinator responsibilities will be to support the CF centre in the access, coordination and delivery of CF trials to all patients who are eligible. And at Alder Hey, not only our local patients, but further patients in our local district general hospitals. An example would be work I'd be involved in is if a new trial was set up, then the coordinator would look at this, would try and turn around a bit quickly, as there's often like a short deadline to meet, so that having somebody there would be able to help with that and coordinate it and facilitate this. It means that we can turn this around in a quick process. Another important part of my role would be supporting patients and their parents through the study process. Would be through screening, assessments, investigations, and the study visits throughout the study period, which could last up to 2 years.
And what do you think the impact of your role's been so far for the patients that attend your clinic and for the team that you work with?
Well, I would say that the impact for having a CTAP coordinator there just improves the opportunity for our patients to be involved in research, as I would identify research available and what patients are eligible. Having a CTAP coordinator there means that the CF centre, there's a named person through this process, and that they will help coordinate the visits, support the investigations, and through the trial process, and help support the parents about what it means in terms of commitment and time for them. For the CF team, it would mean that there's a designated person there who identifies research opportunities. This person can assess its importance and practicality. Do we have patients who are eligible? Do we have the resources available to run the study at our site? But also means that there's a designated person that helps make things run smoothly, and there's obviously strict guidelines and regulatory bodies, and the companies that run the studies want these to be run to the best they can, so I would help support that as well.
And it's probably, as you say, they're thinking about capacity. Hopefully the capacity has been increased so that there is more opportunity for trials to be run at more centres, and more opportunities for people to take part in those trials.
Yeah,
definitely. Are there any additional considerations for running trials for children? Because obviously you're based at Alder Hey, which is a paediatric centre.
Yeah, so there's definitely more consideration to think of when we have children as professionals. It's important for us to consider the child's age and the level of understanding when we're discussing these studies with them. It's also essential to understand the nature of the research that's taking place during the trial, and the impact on the family and the children. Obviously, more study visits could impact school or college, so they're important considerations that we would take in place when we're discussing the families.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I really appreciate each of you joining the call tonight, and I think it really highlights the importance of the community involvement work stream as part of the Trials Accelerator as well. So we really need to ensure that the experiences of people living with CF are really considered when trials are being designed. What research is it that's going to happen? And each of you on the call has helped greatly with our involvement work stream. You've helped with contributions towards our literature, so our booklets, our leaflets. Caitlin, you feature on our leaflet which explains clinical trials for teenagers, and Jane, you're in our information booklet which has a wealth of information about clinical trials. Rob and Jane, again, you've joined various focus groups where we've discussed the different symptoms of CF and how that impacts on your day, and potentially what you would want to see from new treatments, how they would fit in around your daily lives, and what's important to you, what are the outcomes and what are the measures of those trials that are going to be really important to you and make a difference. And as we go forward, we've got to think about how trials are going to be changing and adapting, maybe even to fit around the COVID situation at the moment, so reducing trips into hospital, but also thinking about as people start on CFTR modulators, you know, what research is it that is going to need to be carried out, and how are we going to do that, you know, with the CF landscape and CF as a condition changing. So we do run an annual survey. Actually, it was due to close on the 31st of October, but we kept it open for a few days. So if anybody who's joined the call this evening would like to add some of their thoughts around clinical trials opportunities, the link would be posted in the chat, and that really helps to inform us about what the community, what's important to the community, and how we can take that forward. So that would be great. And I'll hand back to Becca. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much to Rob, Jane and Caitlin for being so open to sharing your experiences of trials and what motivated you to take part. And thanks also to Vicky for giving us an insight into her role as a paediatric CF trial coordinator. And actually our national team of CF trial coordinators we fund through the Trials Accelerator has been one of the biggest success stories of the programme, because not only do these people provide a familiar point of contact for the CF community about taking part in trials, but they also play very much a supporting role for children, adults, families throughout the duration that you're taking part in a trial. I'm now delighted to welcome our final guest speaker of the evening, Dr. George Bogart, who joins us this evening from the US. George is a consultant pulmonologist and a senior member of the CF Foundation's Therapeutics Development Network.
Thanks so much for letting me join you. I'm just trying to find the right little view of my screen. There we go. It's exciting to join you this evening, and I have some information to share that gives you a broad perspective on all of the therapies that are currently being tested and supported. The focus is going to be really on a lot of trials that are linked to what the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation is currently working on. And the way I think about this is really two main groups of treatments. One is to restore CFTR function, which is really addressing the underlying defect. And this category really encompasses the modulators, which have had a lot of recent attention and their phenomenal impact on clinical outcomes. Talk about other therapies that are moving toward rare nonsense mutations, and then the ultimate goal of gene therapy or gene editing therapies. And then move to managing the complications of cystic fibrosis affecting multiple organ systems, but really also centering on the management of infection, inflammation, mucus clearance, and then nutritional, GI, and endocrine therapies. So from the big picture view, really we are always dealing with the complications related to a mutated CFTR gene. And one way to think about this is that the current modulator space is really working to repair the CFTR protein. But if you don't have CFTR protein, you have to find some strategy to restore it. And then finally, for a long-term curative therapy, it really would be to either fix or replace the CFTR gene through gene transfer or gene editing. So the pipeline typically looks like some combination of these bars. I like this diagram in particular because in the upper panel you see the therapies that are currently available to people with CF by category. The modulator class, the mucus clearance class, anti-inflammatory, and then antibiotics. So I think that in the first part, I'd really like to focus on this cluster of therapies that are currently in either preclinical or early phase trials that are treating the underlying defect. Certainly the ones that are currently available in the CFTR modulator class, in the US we call it Trikafta, and outside the US it's Kaftrio. certainly this has had a phenomenal impact, and we are anticipating the approval and release of this drug to the next younger age group of 6 to 11-year-old children. We've had longstanding experience now with Kalydeco or Cambi, Symdeko or Symkevi, and it's phenomenal that we are getting close to the point of being able to prescribe Kalydeco for children soon after the time of diagnosis. This is really fulfillment of a dream that the parents of children with CF began searching for many, many decades ago. The other modulators that are currently under development are the cluster from the proteostasis group, which is actually merged with Humanity, and they have a 3-drug combination, which is a potentiator, corrector, and amplifier. And certainly AbbVie is also continuing to work on drug development with 2 correctors and 1 potentiator. So this is an area that is moving forward rather quickly across a number of different compounds. However, this is really focused on the 90% of the CF population that has 1 or 2 copies of the F508del mutation. So that we have this robust cluster that is present. I pulled this from the US CF Foundation website. So these are all that are currently in a very active form, focusing primarily on the F508del mutation and some other residual mutations. But if we look at the lower part of the pipeline, these are in preclinical or early phase 1 studies. However, they represent the work that's being focused on nonsense and rare CF mutations, which is still a fairly large group, 10% of the population that is not responsive to modulators. And here it really is focusing on restoring CFTR protein in a condition where no protein is being made at all. And in order to do this, the approaches are to actually try small molecules that will read through some of these abnormal stop mutations in the gene, or to give mRNA therapy to replace the mRNA that is not able to make the right protein, or short nucleotides. Excuse me. So some of the approaches are that the HID-CF program by the CTN in Europe is developing organoids for rare mutations. Translate Bio is looking at mRNA for normal CFTR protein regardless of the gene mutation. Icogen is looking at nonsense mutations, recode therapies, also suppressor tRNA for nonsense mutations. And finally, a group in Southern Research Institute is only focused on nonsense mutations. Curative therapies, on the other hand, are really approaches that would work for everyone with CF. And these are really to fix or replace the CFTR gene. And this approach is really by gene editing to correct the malfunctioning CFTR gene. The CRISPR-Cas9 has gotten a lot of visibility recently because of its ability to do gene editing or to devise a way to actually transfer an entire CF gene into the cells where CFTR needs to function. So what are the barriers that we're facing in order to accomplish these huge leaps forward? Well, one part is to really decide how you're going to deliver this DNA package to the cells. How long will it last? How will you get it into the cells? And what will be the package to put that DNA in so that it will be acceptable to the body? The other important question is, what cells will you target? Will you put it in a lung, or will you go to the entire body? So these are things that are currently being worked out by a number of scientists and companies. The adeno-associated virus is a very attractive delivery mechanism because it can go into a specific part of the gene and then be transcribed. There's been a lot of preclinical work in this area and a number of companies that are working on this. And really, this is really to give a healthy CFTR gene to the lung cells to create normally functioning CFTR, again, regardless of what an individual CFTR gene mutation is. So this is groundbreaking work that is going on in the US and around the world. and is quite dependent on the ability of scientists to straddle a number of hurdles that have previously blocked the success when gene therapy was first undertaken 20 years ago. In order to kind of put this in further perspective, this USCF Foundation is really working with quite a few companies and supporting a lot of novel approaches. This timeline shows the number of companies that have been engaged and have been invited to apply for this Path to a Cure funding. And $34 million has already been committed to these programs. So this is not just a dream, this is really a well-supported, well-thought-out, with strong science behind it. And this gives an idea of just the range of programs that are currently going on for CFTR restoration for nonsense mutations, the different approaches, as well as gene delivery programs, both viral and non-viral, gene editing, CRISPR and non-CRISPR techniques, as well as the need to do animal models before these actually move into clinical trials. So I wanted to shift gears to look at the other part of the drug development pipeline, to the areas that I mentioned briefly to manage the complications of cystic fibrosis. We are very well aware of all the anti-infective agents that are currently available that are being used in a variety of ways to manage and maintain lung health. Infection continues to be an ongoing issue, and it's still too early to know how modulator therapies are going to affect this predisposition regarding bacteria typical for people with CF. And the list of anti-infective agents under investigation is also quite long. Here is a sample of some of the approaches. Some are quite novel. Gallium is a compound that's nearly identical to iron that can get in and essentially kill antibiotic-resistant strains of Pseudomonas. It's already been FDA approved for IV use in people, and it's being used in trials for both IV administration and for an inhaled route. Another breakthrough area is phage therapy, which is initially being targeted against multi-resistant Pseudomonas. There have been some amazing case reports of its efficacy. Bacteriophages are viruses that kill specific strains of bacteria, and these are found in nature. These are normal predators of bacteria. And so cocktails of these phages are being used and tested to see what is the best approach for killing multiple drug-resistant Pseudomonas. Another approach is nitric oxide, which can be either inhaled or chemically induced to be produced within the body cells to use its antimicrobial properties to kill bacteria. There's also, in this last one, the TB Alliance, a lot of interest in how we best manage Mycobacterium abscessus and Mycobacterium avium complex, because these are very difficult to treat infections, which are becoming a greater issue for clinicians and people with CF. So there is definitely a focus in taking on any new therapies and applying these to the CF community. If I switch gears again to anti-inflammatory agents, this is a much smaller part of the pipeline. So far, clinical use is really available for high-dose ibuprofen, which can be remarkably effective if you look at epidemiologic studies from registries. However, the current pathway for anti-inflammatory drugs includes these 4 agents that have been in a variety of phase 2 and phase 1 studies looking at various aspects of blunting the inflammatory response, everything from inhibiting the inflammatory cells that release neutrophil elastase that can be very destructive to the airway, to, I mentioned, increasing nitric oxide or antioxidant agents. Mucociliary clearance is something that we recognized and was important to enhance, whether it was through chest physiotherapy, but pulmozyme, as was mentioned earlier today, is one of the earliest CF-specific therapies to be developed and used clinically. Hypertonic saline also has been used, and recently in the US, I believe they approved mannitol or bronchitol, also to enhance clearance. But the newer agents that are listed here really have properties to either add salt, increase the chloride on the airway surface, or to block the excessive sodium reabsorption that dehydrates the airways, or finally to change some aspect of the physical chemical properties of mucus itself. So I want to close by referring anyone who is interested in learning more to the cff.org website. Under the research tab here, you can find the area that focuses on restoring CFTR function. If, for example, you're interested in learning more about modulators or gene therapies, you can ask to explore the area on nonsense and rare mutations. You can read more about gene therapy for cystic fibrosis, gene delivery systems, and the latest area is really stem cells. Can we treat a subpopulation of cells in the lung and cure those cells, and then put those cells back in the lung to repopulate the airway to give a long-term cure for the deficit in CFTR function. So again, this is for reading at your leisure. The website has quite a bit of information on it, and that really all of these pipeline slides and graphs are really derived from the interactive pipeline. So you can go to that foundation website, click on any of these, and read more about the status of each of these trials, the sponsor, and what the outcomes are. And finally, I just wanted to close saying that we are currently now in the wonderful era of defining what is cystic fibrosis for people on modulators. But despite that, we also have to continue a focus on managing infection, inflammation, hydration, and the other organ systems that are being affected by dysfunctional CFTR. And finally, the long-term view to develop a successful path to a cure so that it will be a long-term solution for every patient and person with cystic fibrosis. So I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. That was such an interesting talk, and it's really exciting and reassuring to see that the drug development pipeline shows no sign of slowing down. And it really illustrates the importance of having the infrastructure like the Trials Accelerator in place to support a large number of clinical trials, which we're obviously going to be expecting over the coming years. So thank you so much. If anyone's got any questions for George, please submit them via the chat box. We're running a little bit behind time, but we'll move on to the Q&A part of our session. And apologies in advance that we probably won't have time to ask all of your questions, but we will get back to you afterwards if we don't answer your question this evening. So to start off with, this is a question for Dr. Rebecca Thelsfield. Someone submitted a question which said, my child is 12 weeks old with CF. What are the chances that Kaftrio will be available to him by the time he's 2? And are there any other options for him right now, or anything that to be optimistic or hopeful for?
Okay, so thank you for that, for that question. I think that there is so much to be optimistic for at the moment for babies coming born today, because obviously they're going to be able to benefit from so many treatments without having years and years of CF lung disease. So they're going to be in a really good position to benefit from any of these treatments. And I guess what is available now will depend on what all the baby's particular gene variants are, because if your gene variant is one of the things that is applicable for the either Kaftrio, then that can now be given to babies as young as 3 or 4 months old. We know that or can be given from the age of 2, and I'm sure that you know is not that long away, and providing babies are staying healthy, and most children these days do stay well until the age of 2, they'll be able to benefit greatly from the modulator treatments when they get to 2. As for will Kaftrio be available by the time that 12-week-old baby is 2, we just don't know. My guess would be probably not. I think that is a little bit soon. I would hope that by the time that 12-week-old baby is 2, we will be able to begin prescribing it for the 6 to 11-year-olds, would be my hope. We're just about to start the studies in the UK for the 2 to 5-year-olds. So I think that within the next year and a half, it probably won't be available for 2-year-olds, but I would hope that that baby will get it before they get to their 6th birthday. I'm absolutely certain that baby will have it on their 6th birthday, because I think that we're not too far away from that, perhaps a year or 2, but probably not close enough for the second birthday, but I don't think we're a million miles away. But it is really important we do the studies. It is important that they are done properly. We need to make sure that these treatments are done are safe for all the age groups, and whilst they are being done through with relative speed, it's important that corners aren't cut and that we do it in a safe manner. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Becky. That was a really, really helpful answer. A question for Vicky, the CF trial coordinator. My daughter is not at a trial centre, so how could she go about taking part in a trial or putting herself forward for a trial?
Hi, thanks very much for the question. So I would direct the parent to the CF trial clinical digital hub, and this is a fantastic tracker on the website, and it brings together all CF studies that are currently recruiting in the UK. They can have a look on the trials tracker, and you can filter the results down to genotype, age, location, and then there's a brief description of the study there. So if they have a read of that and they would think that they are eligible for that study, then I would recommend that they speak to their local team for any more details, but also that they can contact the CF Trust clinical trial team, who will provide some more information for them, and they will direct that request through to the site that is recruiting there.
Thanks, Vicky. And I think just to add, do speak to your CF team about trial opportunities. Even if a CF centre doesn't run its own trials, your CF team, your clinician, will be able to do what's called a research referral. So if there's a trial that your daughter is eligible for happening at another CF centre in the UK, whether it's nearby or further afield, it is possible to do a research referral where you can refer someone with CF to take part in a trial happening at another CF centre. It's always worth letting your CF team know about your interest in trials. And also on our digital hub, we do have a page listing all of the profiles and contact details of our 20 CF trial coordinators. So it might also be worth contacting the one closest to where you live and letting them know that you're interested in your daughter taking part in a trial. And that way they might be able to keep you updated about any trials happening at their centre in the near future. Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. So this is for George. You briefly touched upon some of the research for the 10% who are not eligible for some of the new modulators. Are you able to offer any hope that these minority might have something available for them in the not too long future?
Yes, I think that it is really a very important focus. And if you go to the pipeline and you look at how far along some of these are, many of them are still in a preclinical stage, but the one with the messenger RNA, I think the Translate Bio group is probably the furthest along with a very novel approach. A number of others have tried small molecules to try to have them read through these stop mutations. And I think that those unfortunately did not move forward. I think we learned a lot from that. Those studies did not get to a good outcome, but it is challenging. However, it seems like at some point somebody makes a big discovery that is then a leap forward. Even with moving to a phase 1 or phase 2 study, to then expand it to a larger number in phase 3 often will be a number of years. So if everything goes well, it could be that something is available in 3 years, but that would be me looking into a crystal ball. I think the most important thing is that there is a large group that is looking critically at how to move forward in this area, because without a focus and and financial support from the foundation and other groups, it just won't happen. So I think it's high priority and great science.
Thank you, George. And in Europe, there's some of you may have heard of the HIT-CF study, which is a study trialling experimental modulator treatments on those with rare mutations. And I know Amy will be sharing a link to that study. It's no longer recruiting any participants, it's closed to recruitment. But if you'd like to learn more about that trial and what it's trying to do, you can follow the link that Amy will share in a moment. Okay, so we've now reached the end of this evening's event, so I just wanted to thank everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And also special thanks to all of our guest speakers for sparing the time to join us this evening and sharing their expertise and their experiences of trials as well. Our next CF Live event will be on the 4th of December, and this one will be a little bit different to the previous events, as it will be our Christmas party. So this will be for all the family and a way for us to say thank you to the wonderful CF community we have. So there'll be lots of festive fun and entertainment, so hopefully you can join us then. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a nice evening.